good evening, and thank you for joining us this evening. We are excited to have this conversation with you all tonight. We are here with members of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, and we are talking about pediatric vaccinations. And so we know that the vaccines have been authorized all the way down to age of 5, and they're still doing some testing to get vaccines approved for children under the age of 5, but they've been authorized all the way down to the age of 5. But as we also know, parents can be a little bit wary, a little bit concerned about getting their children vaccinated. And so we're here to give you some answers. We're here to talk about it, and we got the best panel. I'm just going to say that out front. We've got the best panel of people to discuss it. There's some faces that you might recognize, as my man, Dr. Gary Gibbons is here. He is the man, and I'm telling you, he is going to give us some great information. We've got Dr. Campbell and Dr. Zimmerman. They're going to bring up, and we also have Dr. Fouda. She's going to be joining us a little later. She's probably getting caught up because she's very, very, she's got a lot of things on her plate, and so hopefully she'll be joining us a little bit later on this evening. But we could roll with these three right here and get all the information out that we need to get taken care of. So I'm going to give you their particulars real quick as we are talking. So first up, we've got Dr. Gary Gibbons. He is the director of the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And then we also have Dr. Andrew Campbell. He is a director of comprehensive sickle cell program at the Children's National Health System. We've got Dr. Kenesha Obi Zimmerman. She is an associate professor of pediatrics at Duke University. And I think I heard Dr. Genevieve Fouda, and she is a pediatric infectious disease researcher at Duke University. So I wanted to say welcome to each and every one of you. Thank you for joining us and being here this evening. You can talk, but it's okay.
It's our pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for having us, Ella.
Thank you for having us. Thank you so much.
It's all good. It's all good. I know. We're just getting started. We're going to have some fun. We're going to, this is a serious subject, and we're going to give it the seriousness it is. But I want to advise the people that are watching us to drop in the comment section. Let us know where you're watching from. We like to see where all of our audience is watching from. Number 2, if you know somebody that's a parent that needs this information, if they have children that haven't been vaccinated or are questioning about whether their children should get vaccinated, tag them and let them know that we're having this conversation right now here on blackdoctor.org. And finally, if you have any questions, make sure you drop those in the comment section as well, and we will get those questions answered later on in the program so we can help you make that vaccine decision. We are not telling you to vaccinate your child. What we're doing is we're going to provide the information for you to make an informed decision either way. And so that's what this conversation is designed about, to answer your questions so we can get to that informed decision. So first up, we're going to start with Dr. Gibbons. And so everybody else, we will drop y'all off, and it will be a one-on-one with me and Dr. Gibbons, and we're going to have a brief conversation, and we'll bring y'all back in a few moments to ask you some questions as well. So stick around. We need you both, Dr. Campbell and Dr. Zimmerman. Okay, Dr. Gibbons.
Yes, tell us.
First question is, we know that parents, they have questions. We know parents have lots of questions. I'm a parent myself. I have 2 children, so I had a lot of questions. In particular, even though my son was 13 at the time, I still had a lot of questions, and I had some concerns. What can you say to assure parents like myself and others at this, right at the top of the session? What can you tell parents to assure them about vaccines?
Well, Ellis, I think one thing's important to step back and sort of see where we are. We are at this point at a sobering moment for our country, where we're actually mourning the death of 1 million Americans who've succumbed to this virus with COVID-19. So clearly, this has been devastating, and it's been most devastating to communities of color. Black and brown communities in particular have had 2-fold more risk of hospitalizations and deaths. And that's for all of our communities across the lifespan, from our elders down to our children. We've been most severely affected. And the best way to protect our community is to get these vaccines in arms and to vaccinate as many of our folks as possible, because we know that that prevents the severe complications of this virus. As always, in developing a response, I'm at the National Institutes of Health, in which we fund the research that helped develop the vaccines. And at each step of the way, safety was at the foremost in our minds and those of the public-private partnerships we've been part of to accelerate the development of these safe and effective vaccines that have been studied meticulously and have been shown to be safe and effective and effective in hundreds of thousands and nearly millions of people now. So we know these medicines do good and are well tolerated in a variety of populations. In fact, at NIH, we did specific measures to be sure that the trials that tested the safety and effectiveness of these vaccines were tested in a wide variety of populations. And we wanted to be sure it works as safe and effective in communities of color. And so that's particularly important. And each step along the way in the developing vaccines, we've been monitoring that safety profile. We have specific boards set up to ensure that these agents are safe and effective, and working through with the Food and Drug Administration, the Centers for Disease Control, all making sure that that happens. And indeed, I might point out to your audience that we've enlisted the collaboration of HBCUs and minority serving institutions that were actually part of the trials that tested these vaccines. And indeed, the president of Meharry serves on the FDA Safety Advisory Board. And so our community should have confidence that these are agents that can protect our community. But it's critical that we take advantage of it. And it's clear, as you pointed out, what we've learned in the adults is where we start with development and ensure that it's safe and effective, and then gradually introduce it to children. And again, the results are excellent among adolescents. And then this week, today, FDA approval of one of the vaccines, the messenger RNA vaccines for ages 5 to 11 has been approved, along with the boosters. And so we now have experience with these vaccines. We know it really takes 3 doses to get the full protective effect against the virus. And that's now been approved for children as well above the age of 5. So it's really critical that we get vaccinated, and particularly in our communities, because what we're finding is that of the children who develop severe COVID, and it's only a small number, well, maybe 1% or so, at least half of those are African Americans and Latino children. And so they're the ones that are going to develop the severe complications. And it's really critical that our communities get our children vaccinated.
You know, you said the word community a couple of times, and when we hear, a lot of times in our community we hear government and community, there is a historic kind of distrust. What can we say to let people know that they can trust that this kind of government-backed vaccine is really, and does the government really care about what's happening in our communities?
Yeah, well, so one of the first things that we did at the National Institutes of Health is the largest biomedical research organization in the world, and funding this is we launched what we call the CEAL program, the Community Engaged Alliance Against COVID-19 Disparities. Since we knew early on that, as you point out, Ellis, that there's been a historic challenge of mistrust and, quite frankly, misinformation, and that has adversely affected our communities. And that's why we partnered with historically Black colleges, universities, minority serving institutions, at the communities of color, professional organizations like NMA, Association of Black Cardiologists, nurses, the NAACP, Urban League, partners and collaborators that are embedded in these communities and that are centered in these communities. And we learned a key lesson that it was really important to engage individuals who are already trusted within communities. And so, as we knew from the beginning, yes, we could get some celebrity, Oprah or something, to encourage people to get vaccinated. But more important was the local pastor, the local family doctor or nurse or elder in the church. And if we could engage them and help them understand the benefits, they could be trusted messengers that would help us. And we found that that's been effective. In fact, we've also engaged the youth. So we have in our CEAL collaborations that involve a lot of community-based organizations, over 500 community-based organizations, people embedded in the community who know their neighbors and know and are trusted by their neighbors in this effort as partners. And indeed have engaged teenagers who've been working social media and figuring out ways, what messages resonate that are trustworthy and that will connect with our communities to help them make those informed decisions that you talked about from the top. And that's really been effective in reducing some of that hesitancy that you described.
Well, I mean, you know, you're touching on some subjects that are really, really, I think, important to reiterate, and that is engagement, right? And that's the word that and that's the route it's taken. And we think about what's happened in the past, right? So I know we look back in the past and we see what's happened in the past. There was any engagement, right? It was just one way. You know, the government did this, they did that, and that is how the mistrust and distrust got built up. But in this particular case, and this is such a radical situation, we're talking about a worldwide pandemic that has not happened in 100 years, right? So the last time we had a pandemic of this magnitude was the Spanish flu back in, and I don't want to call it, but the influenza back in the early 20s. And it's almost ironic that it was almost exactly 100 years later that we have another pandemic happen. But this time, instead of just mandating things, what we did is there was engagement. And there was engagement in the community. There was voices along the way. We talked about the President Meharry being on the review board and making sure that all of the data and the numbers that they came back were correct. There was extensive testing, and we're going to talk about how they were tested and how we got to the vaccines being developed so quickly. We can talk about that too. But really, what I'm hearing from you, Dr. Gibbons, is there was a tremendous amount of engagement with our community to show that not only are we care about the community, but we're listening to you, and we're going to let your voice be heard in this specific instance.
Yeah, and I want to give you a shout out as well. That we've leveraged and partnered with the media outlets that engage on a continuous basis these communities that have built up trust as trusted sources of information, like blackdoctors.org and others. And we've gone to, I've done local radio tours and everything else because we know that community is where our community gets information that they know that they can trust. And so it's not just the government saying these things. These are entities that they're familiar with and they know they can turn to and trust. So we appreciate the collaboration we've had with BDO.
Well, thank you. And thank you for coming back. Because if y'all don't remember, Dr. Gibbons was here last year talking about it. And we've had a lot of changes. There's been variants that have been come into play that's happened between then. And so we have to come back, and we wanted to come back and talk specifically about children as we're wrapping up with most school years that are wrapping up now. And the summer break's about to happen. But we know in the fall that over the past 2 years, we've had some increases in terms of the cases going up in the fall and in the winter months. And so we want to make sure that our children are protected. And so we're going to hear, that's why we're here tonight, to give you the information for you and your family. So
actually, if I could, Ellis, one other thing that we're learning that we didn't talk too much about last time was that there not only are people affected by the acute infection that caused COVID-19, but we're also learning about what's so-called long COVID, that after the acute COVID is over, there are people who have persistent symptoms and problems with various organs in their body that can be weeks and months. And now we're getting into a year or more
Yeah.
after the acute infection. And so there's something different about this virus that can
Yes.
have not only the acute effect, but the long-term effect. And again, our early data is indicating that that long COVID, again, is disproportionately affecting Black and Brown communities. So at some point, I'd love to come back and talk about that other effect of long COVID. And that also affects children. There's a syndrome called multisystem inflammatory syndrome of children, in which those kids get really sick after an acute bout with COVID. Some of them end up in the ICU. So there are effects of this virus that are profound. And again, disproportionately, there are African American Latino children being affected by what we call MISI, this multi-system inflammatory syndrome of children. And so the best way to prevent the long COVID and those complications is to get vaccinated and prevent this virus from affecting us. So again, everything points that the safest and most effective way to protect our communities from our elders to our children is to get vaccinated and get boosted.
Well, you said a mouthful there because we're talking about inflammation and we're talking about interactive effects with other conditions, and those conditions that the interactive effects of COVID have, those conditions like high blood pressure, diabetes, high cholesterol, disproportionately impact our communities. And so when we're talking about protecting ourselves, if you've got diabetes and you get COVID on top of that, that is what's causing the disproportionate amount of deaths and hospitalizations from people of color, because we are have a high rate of those interactive illnesses. So we'd love to have you back to talk about that, Dr. Gibbons. I think that would be a wonderful conversation. So people that are still on the fence about getting vaccinated or are thinking about not getting their children vaccinated, we need to talk about those interactive effects. And sometimes either the virus causes these illnesses, or it exacerbates these illnesses to the point where you're being hospitalized. And even as you mentioned earlier, 1 million deaths. And it's hard to really kind of wrap your mind around that many people dying in such a short period of time over an illness like this. So it's a lot to unpack there. But man, Dr. Gibbs, I really enjoy talking to you every time. So I want you to stick around because we got some Q&A at the end, and we want to make sure that,
Sure.
that we have it. So hang around with us, but we got to get to the next person. And I think that is Dr. Genevieve Fouda. I want to make sure I'm saying that right. To get her here on camera. How are you doing?
I'm good. Hi.
I'm glad you're able to join us this evening, and we're going to jump right into the questions that we have for you, because I know you're. So just to reiterate, she is a pediatric infectious disease researcher. So if you need to know some things, this is the person you need to talk to. So the first question I have for you is, why did it take longer to approve the vaccine for children and teens? And why is it taking even longer for our younger children?
So, as we already, mentioned, when you to develop a vaccine, it takes time and it takes, testing and all this testing, because it's important to make sure that the vaccine is safe. And when you test for the safety of the vaccine, and you test for the ability of the vaccine to induce the type of response that you want, for example, antibodies that will protect, and these effects have to be tested in different populations. In addition, it is important to determine what is the dose that will be optimal in different populations. Usually, conducting research in children and in minors also have to be done with, really carefully. There are a lot of, really strict regulation about, the safety and the protection of children. So it is not unusual that, studies in children start only after, safety have been demonstrated in adult studies. Moreover, it is common to do what is called de-escalation, which means that you will test the vaccine first, in adult, then you will move to adolescent, then to older children before going to younger children. And again, All of that is really guided, by making to make sure that this vaccine is safe in this different population. And this is really, what happened, with the COVID vaccine. The vaccine was first tested in adult. When it was found that, the vaccine was safe and that the vaccine was protective, then, the planning of the testing of the vaccine in other, younger population was initiated. And the vaccine dose was also optimized. For example, if you take one of the vaccine, that is commonly administered, like the Pfizer vaccine, as well as the Moderna vaccine, even though it's not yet approved in children, but the dose that they even use in the clinical trial is not the same in adult and in children. And they needed, to take the time to optimize and making sure that they are giving the, best and safest dose for all, population. Think about the fact that, if you take a whatever drug, let's say a Tylenol, as an adult you will not have the same dose of Tylenol as a children, so as a child. So that's why also, for vaccine it's important to make sure that the right optimal dose is determined for each population. And to respond to the second part of the question, why it's taken so long for the younger than 5-year old, part of the reason of this delay is again because the vaccine have to be tested first in adults, then be de-escalated to younger age, and also because they really wanted to make sure that they have the right dose and they have the right regimen to make sure that the optimal protection is observed in children. And the good news is that one of the vaccine company, Moderna, recently submitted an application for approval of vaccine to children less than 6 year old, and it is expected that Pfizer will also submit the application soon. So there is hope that maybe sometime this summer we will finally have a vaccine for the younger group.
Well, you said something that was really important, so I'm gonna repeat it. In that is that when you made your Tylenol kind of example, like we don't give children the same amount of Tylenol as an adult, and so it took a long time to get it approved for children because that was part of the testing process, is to be able to determine what is a safe dosage amount for children. And so before it got approved, they had to be able to determine what that amount was and that it was safe in to be able to administer to children. I think that's an important point that our audience needs to understand, is that they took their time. It wasn't just, oh, we got a vaccine now, we're just going to run it out for everybody. We understand that everybody's different, everybody's body is different, and so they did the steps that they needed to, especially when we're talking about our children, because as parents, we can be protective of our children even more so than of ourselves at times. And so they wanted to make sure it was done right. And so I have one more question here for you, Doc, and that question is, are there any fertility or developmental concerns? Because I know that's been kind of one of the biggest, things we've been hearing about against the vaccine, is that it develops some fertility complications. So are there any fertility or developmental concerns with vaccinating children and teens before they hit puberty? So I guess we're talking about that 5 to about 11, 12, 13 range.
So, and I think, the issue of fertility of vaccine is been, around for years, and with no scientific support. We know that, most vaccines are actually administered early in life. Most vaccines are administered to children. All of us here have received, vaccines as children, and most of us have children. So there is no evidence, that vaccination is associated with any type of fertility or developmental concern. Like any other medicine, vaccines can be associated with side effects, but these side effects are generally mild, like, for example, the pain in the site of injection, low fever, headache, and they usually occur within, 2 to 3 days, after vaccination. There is scientifically, we don't know any mechanism through which the vaccine will lead to effect on fertility or development several years after administration. So I cannot stress enough that, the COVID vaccine have been administered to millions of adults and millions of children today. And several studies have demonstrated that this vaccine have a very good safety profile. So again, I just want to reiterate that, it is important to vaccinate. The vaccine is safe and is the best way to protect our children and our communities.
Well, thank you for that information. We're going to bring on our next guest, but I need you to stick around because we will have some questions for you at the end of the program. And I'm going to encourage our audience to continue to, if you have any questions about vaccinating children, about what's going on with the vaccines in general, please drop those in the comment section so we can ask our guests those questions. So next up, we're going to be bringing on, I believe it's going to be Dr. Campbell is coming up next. It's Dr. Andrew Campbell. He is a pediatric safety expert. And so we're going to have him bring him onto the program and ask him a few questions because he is our safety. We're going to call him a safety guru in order to kind of give you a nice colloquialism in terms of your skill set. So welcome to the program, Dr. Campbell. How are you doing this evening?
Good. Thank you so much. Thanks to blackdoctors.org and CEAL for having this important discussion. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. So we're glad to have you. So here's a question. How do you know that the trials for kids were safe and that the results those trials produce show that the vaccines are safe?
Yeah, that's, I think, probably the most important question for our community. Is it safe? A lot of my patients and my parents and also family members asked this question. They were comfortable with adults, but when it comes to children, they really wanted to know, what hoops did it go through to actually make this vaccine safe? So the CDC, I think, had a really nice description, the journey of your child's vaccine. So I'll just start from the beginning. There's actually safety studies within the biotech company. So, for example, the vaccine companies such as Pfizer, Moderna, for example, they have their own testing of different, we call vials of vaccines. And so what they do is they actually get the best vaccine that they feel is probably going to be safe, but also effective. That's called preclinical stage. Then there's the clinical stage, where the vaccine go through three phases. First is we call phase 1, to about 20 to 100 healthy volunteers. Is the vaccine safe? Does the vaccine seem to work? Are there any serious side effects? How is the size of the dose related to the side effects, for example? And then there is a phase 2 of the study where there's several hundred volunteers or patients. What are the most common side effects they address? How are the volunteers' immune system responding to the vaccine? And then there's the phase 3 study where they test thousands of volunteers. And that's what happened in the pediatric patients. How do kids who get the vaccine and people who get the vaccine compared to those who do not get the vaccine? That's a randomized, we call, controlled trial. Is the vaccine safe in the group that is getting the vaccine versus the group that's not getting the vaccine? Is it effective? What are the most common side effects? So these data is collected, then it's passed on to the FDA, and then the FDA has an advisory panel, as Dr. Gibbons talked about earlier, which is a representation of experts, and they recommend from the results of the trial that this committee recommends should it move forward in recommending this vaccine to children. Then next, then the FDA authorizes it. You heard about this emergency use authorization. But right after that, they then send it to the CDC, to the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices. It's called the AICP. And that's a group of experts, again, that considers how safe the vaccine is given at a specific age. How well does the vaccine work for these specific ages? How serious are the side effects? And then after that, it goes through to the global CDC for CDC approval. So there are so many steps. This journey, it doesn't end there. After the vaccine, so to date, since May 11th, 2022, according to the CDC, 9.9 million children between ages 5 and 11 have received at least one dose of the vaccine, and 17 million children between the ages of so 17 million children 12 to 17 years of age received the vaccine. So those number of patients are further monitored, okay, through what's called the vaccine adverse event reporting system. So it doesn't end after you get the vaccine. In fact, you yourself can actually report through what we call the patient portal, where you can actually report safety of the vaccine if your child has a severe reaction. Okay, so all this data is collected. Also, data is collected from various healthcare organizations called the Vaccine Safety Data Link, called VSD. So that information is also collected from hospitals, pharmacies, if there's any side effects. So all of these are put together in a database. So there's ongoing monitoring of side effects as it relates to this. So overall, the vaccine so far has been shown to be safe in children 5 years and older, based on those vaccine safety steps.
So just for those, I'm going to summarize that. That's a lot of steps. Okay, that's a lot of steps.
It's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of steps, and even what I found to be interesting is that we had it's one comment, but people say it's probably going to be safe. I think there's only one absolute in life, right? and that's going to end at some point. And so if we're looking for, and I'm going to get on my soapbox a little bit, I'm going to get off a bit. But if we're looking for something that's absolute, 100%, there's only one thing that you can say is absolute 100%, right? And so that's going to happen over the course of life. Everything else is subjective. And so we have to be careful when we're looking for absolutes in one specific instance, and we allow for not absolutes in other areas. Like, because when you because I remember, I'm old enough to remember that Tylenol crisis that happened back in the 70s, and there was no absolute. But nobody stopped taking Tylenol. It was only a brief period, but people kept taking Tylenol. So, all right, I'm gonna get off my soapbox because that's not what we're here for. But it just kind of rubs me the wrong way when people are looking for absolutes when we're talking about this. And you just went through a laundry list of safety checks and along the way, and steps that have to be completed along the way that get checked and rechecked by independent boards to make sure that these vaccines are safe. And so, and as safe as they can be. So is there an absolute? No, there's not an absolute, but this is pretty close to as much in terms of the scientific realm and the vaccination realm. They did all the precautions, took all the precautions, and made it as safe as possible so children can be protected from this virus. So, all right. I'm off my soapbox. I'm sorry. I had a moment. I had to get on it right quick. So I have another question for you here. And has your experience on the DSMB influenced how you talk to your patients' parents or caregivers about the vaccine?
Yes. So that's a great point. Absolutely. You're talking about the Data Safety Monitoring Board. And just to let you know, as everyone know, the FDA has oversight of clinical investigation of any type of clinical trial of drugs, vaccines. And the bottom line is this is the responsibility of the investigator and the oversight committee to make sure the vaccine is safe. So in addition to what I told you, while the trial is actually happening, there is also checks from the from the hospitals that are participating in the trial. It's called the Institutional Review Board. They're
Right.
also getting information. There's also internal monitoring. There's audits, okay, that is by U.S. and international regulatory agencies, for example. But here in the U.S., there's audits mandated by the FDA and the NIH. And the Data Safety Monitoring Board is important because this is a group of individuals that reviews and evaluates the accumulated data that's collected from these trials. They want to make sure that there's subject safety. They want to make sure that the conduct of the study is appropriate and does not go beyond the safety boundaries of the trial, and making sure that the trial is going to be effective. But at any point that the DSMB board feels that it's not going to be safe, it's too risky. We're starting to see points in the trial where there's too many, we call serious adverse events, for example.
Right.
Then the trial will be terminated, and the DSMB board has that authority. Now, I will say this: it has influenced me in talking to my patients greatly because it allows me to reflect upon my expertise on these on this data monitoring safety board to really provide some comfort for my families, to say, hey, I can tell you I have watched this happen from the beginning to the end on these for these the DSMB boards, we call it. And I feel comfortable that this same process is implemented within the COVID-19 vaccine trials as well. The other point I want to make is part of this very important point is that also Black and brown people were also included in these trials from the day one. So there's also important representation of people of all races and ethnicities here in the United States, very diverse, but more importantly, it does represent a wide range of patients who enter the trial. So that's very important in terms of making sure it's safe and effective for all populations.
That's a very good point, because I think, prior to, as we know, the existence of Black people in this country hasn't always been stellar. And so prior to that, there was very little, if any, participation in the development of medications and vaccines. And so we just had to hope it worked in our population. For the development of this particular vaccine, there were a number of Black and brown population members that were part of the development process. So now we know not only is it safe, but it's effective in people of color. And so I think that's an important point to make. And I'm glad you made that point. So Dr. Campbell, I need you to stick around. We got one more person we got to get to. We got to get to Dr. Zimmerman, but thank you for letting us know about all of those different steps and checks along the way, to safety checks, and make sure. And if there's any uncomfortability, that's why when the Johnson vaccine had an issue, guess what? They were able to pause it for a period of time, because this board is always monitoring, and they're still monitoring, even though mandates are getting lifted and everybody's trying to go back to normal life. That board is still monitoring this vaccine every single day to make sure it is safe and there's not any adverse effects. So thank you for serving on that board, and thank you for providing that information. We will ask you some questions a little bit later on in the program. So finally, we have Dr. Kenesha Zimmerman. How are you doing? Welcome to the program, Dr. Zimmerman.
Alice, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
We are happy to have you here. So Dr. Zimmerman is a pediatrician. So we're going to go right to the source. We went from the top of the NIH with Dr. Gibbons. We talked to a researcher, and we talked to a safety expert, and now we're going to talk directly to a pediatrician. So my first question for you is, as a practicing pediatrician, how do you address parents' concerns about getting the vaccine for their children?
Alice, I think that's a really great question, and I have to answer it from the vantage point of being the ICU doctor that I am. So I am the doctor that you do not want to see, and I am the doctor you don't want to see with COVID. I also have to address it from the vantage point of what I do when I'm not in the ICU, and that's doing pediatric clinical trials and doing pediatric drug development. So all the things that Dr. Campbell said, I know are true because I've gone to the FDA to try to get drugs approved. But when I'm talking to parents, I really talk about, what are the risks and benefits of the drug or the vaccine versus what are the risks of COVID itself. We know from everything that you've heard today that the vaccine itself is safe, and we know it's effective against severe disease, including hospitalization and death. We know that COVID, certainly, while most kids do actually pretty well, there are kids who have to come see me. They do not do well. There are kids even who die. So there are kids who have very, very severe disease, as Dr. Gibbons, I think, mentioned earlier today. And it doesn't feel good when we're talking, in my office or when we're talking in the unit by a bedside because a kid has come in with severe disease. Not only these kind of short-term effects that we've seen, but Dr. Gibbons also mentioned the longer-term effects associated with kids, specifically multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children, and the MIS-C that he's talking about. Kids come in so sick, Ellis. They come in very, very sick. They have failing organs. They often have to have medications to support their blood pressure, to support their heart. They have to have, sometimes they have to be on life support to support their breathing. It's very, very serious. And the thing that's really, I think, concerning, not only as a researcher or a pediatrician, but also as a mom, is that most of the time, almost every child that I've taken care of with this disease, they're healthy before. Sometimes they didn't even know that they had COVID a couple of weeks before. So that's concerning. And those are the things that we talk about. The other things, I have to kind of talk from a vantage point of being a mom as well. It's been, this has been so chaotic, right? Like the pandemic has been crazy, chaotic, and really out of control. I felt so out of control. Nothing that I've had to depend much of the pandemic on what other people are doing, right? To keep my kids safe, to make sure that they're keeping their mask up, to make sure that other people are keeping their mask up, they're not coughing on my children, all of those types of things. So when the vaccine became available, I was so excited because finally it was an opportunity to make a decision that I could control, that I could take back the power, and that I could protect my children myself, right? Like that is our goal as parents. We want to protect them. We want to do everything we can to keep them safe. This was my way to do that. And that felt really good, to the point that I enrolled my own child into one of the vaccine trials with my 15-year-old daughter, whom I adore. So I love her very much. But this was...
I was about to say, okay, is that child abuse? That's not child abuse.
No, absolutely not. It was like, and the weight that came off of me was amazing because I knew at that point I was taking control. I could protect her in a way that I couldn't have done before.
You're bringing up an interesting point. I'm going to ask you about the dosage for it, but control, that you said that word several times. And what we're talking about, there is a mental health component to this whole pandemic process that remember we had to shut down and people were home and many were isolated. We saw so many adverse effects in terms of on our mental health because of the lack of control that came by us getting hit very, very rapidly by this pandemic. And so getting vaccinated, getting boosted, getting our children vaccinated gives all of us some semblance of control. I felt more comfortable, not that I was going out with maskless, but I felt a lot more comfortable when I got vaccinated because I said, at least I know my body is prepared to deal with this virus if I do find a way to contract it. So thankfully to this point, I'm not going to wood. I haven't caught it yet, but I feel like I'm prepared because I have been vaccinated and boosted. And that gave me a sense of control and peace of mind, which settled some of the mental issues. So again, there's another person got me on my soapbox. I got to get off the soapbox today. So the next question is dosage for children. Is it different for kids and teens versus adults? Because I know that was always a question. It was like, can a child body accept it? So is the dosage amount different for kids and teens?
Absolutely. And Dr. Fouda touched on this before, and she used the example of Tylenol, which is exactly the example I would have used, right? Because this is something that we all give to our children, but we know what we give the baby is in a little dropper, and what we give, your teenager is different from, what you might give your 5-year-old. So certainly, these drugs go through evaluation to make sure that we're getting the dose that's enough, but not too much. And that's the same thing that's happened with vaccination. That's why there are these age bands, right? Because it has to do with the weight and what your body can actually handle, whether you're 5 to 11 years old, 12 and older, or less than 5 years old. So absolutely.
And and I think that's good to know. So that's why I was like, we need to reiterate that point in terms of the dosage amount, because and it's a safe assumption, but we want to make sure that it's said out loud that there is a different dosage amount. So finally, here's a question that's interesting. Should children who have already had COVID and survived still get vaccinated?
They should. In fact, they should. There are probably at least three reasons why this is the case. The first is that we know when you get vaccinated after you've already had COVID, you have additional immunity. So you are in a place where you are even stronger to fight additional infection coming forward. The second reason really is around the fact that there have been studies suggesting that there are some people who've had COVID and we can't find any trace that they've had COVID, which means their body didn't necessarily make antibodies. Their body isn't necessarily, prepped to fight additional disease when it comes through. The third reason really has to do with variants. So we know that fortunately, vaccines have had really good coverage for severe disease across all variants. Even when people are getting, if you're vaccinated and you're boosted in particular, even when you get COVID, you don't have severe disease. Usually it's pretty mild. Right. So that the vaccines have provided us really good coverage across all variants, including through Omicron. We have seen that there hasn't been as good of coverage with those people who have been infected, particularly those people who have been infected early. So it doesn't provide as much coverage. And we know that more variants are coming. We hear about it all the time. So relying on, the disease itself to provide you immunity in the future isn't necessarily the way to go because of the variants.
Right. But look, we could do a whole show about variants, how they're created. We could, so we're probably gonna have to have y'all back. I'm just gonna go ahead and say it out loud. We're gonna have to have y'all back because we got to talk about these things, and it's important because it's more important now, in my opinion. And this is strictly Ellis speaking. It's more important now because things are opening back up. Mass mandates are being lifted. People are engaging more, going back to more mass events, concerts, sporting events, going to restaurants. And so we need to be more vigilant about maintaining our safety. Otherwise, we could possibly get thrown back and have that 1 million person number that Dr. Gibbons mentioned earlier rise even higher if we're not paying attention and staying on top of making sure that we're protecting ourselves while we're re-engaging with the world. We need to make sure that we're protected. So, all right, again, third soapbox. That's it. I promise you that's the last one today. So we're going to bring back our other guests. We're going to bring back Dr. Gibbons and Dr. Campbell. And also we're going to bring back Dr. Fouda as we're wrapping up this program here with the NIH CEAL members. We are talking about vaccinating children, and we're talking about, and I love the title of this program. It's COVID-19 Science and Your Kids Get the Facts. And that's what we are here to do, is get the facts so people can make an informed decision. We've talked to a pediatrician that works in the ICU, so she's seen it directly with her eyes. We talked to somebody who's worked on the safety review board. We talked to a researcher, and we talked to the man himself, and that is Dr. Gary Gibbons. So as we're wrapping up here, any final thoughts? We will start with you, Dr. Gibbons.
Well, again, thank you, Ellis, for doing this. It's really important to inform communities of color about what has been a devastating pandemic. And ways in which we can all work together, protect each other. And it's availing ourselves of these safe and effective vaccines and being sure that, as you pointed out, you got all your shields in place, all your protective gear. That if you're in a storm, it's not enough to have just a little umbrella. You really need the galoshes, the coat, everything you can to protect yourself. And getting vaccinated and boosted, and be careful about distancing and masking is important, particularly as you say things open up and people are in the indoor places. And it's really critical that we give that maximum protection. And we definitely want to be sure we protect the most vulnerable, our children. I'll stop there.
Absolutely, absolutely. Well said. Dr. Fouda.
Um, First of all, thanks again, for having us tonight. It's really, an important topic. And what I would like to emphasize is, again, that it's important to look for the right information. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and I'm glad that, you are listening to this, because you need to get to the right people, get the right information. And one misconception is about the how the why we had the vaccine fast, how the research was done. I can tell you that this vaccine is based on very solid research. You heard today about all the safety that went into the development of this vaccine. Similarly, it's the result of year of research. How you may ask why year of research? Because it's not the first time that we have a coronavirus. And fortunately, there have been some researchers, especially at the NIH, who since the previous pandemic have been continuing to do research, and that really is what paid off today, and why we had this vaccine. It is based on solid research. I really encourage you to get the right information and get vaccinated, get your kids vaccinated. It's important for your family, it's important for the community.
Absolutely. It is safe. Dr. Campbell.
Again, thank you for having us for this important discussion. I'll just quickly just say, hopefully from today's presentation and discussion, you feel that you feel safer about giving your child the COVID-19 vaccine. As you protect your child, you're protecting our community. So I hopefully we can increase the number of children, especially in the Black community, to get the COVID vaccine for their children. Thanks again.
And Dr. Zimmerman.
Thank you so much for having me. This is really an amazing opportunity that we have to protect our children. They've been through so much over the last couple of years, in particular, like being out of school. We've had to, come along with them. This is an opportunity to make sure that we can keep them safe. It's so very important so that they can have healthy and prosperous lives moving forward. Thank you.
Absolutely. And I will add, when your children their bodies are still developing, and we say that, and that's been used as a reason to not get vaccinated. And I will flip that. I will turn that around and say that's a reason to get vaccinated, because their body's still developing. You do not want to have them get a virus introduced to their system that can disrupt or corrupt that development process. And that is what the coronavirus has shown. COVID has shown to do is disruptive. It's been disruptive to adults. As Dr. Gibbons mentioned, it's been very disruptive to over 1 million adults here in the United States. And so it can be disruptive. Think about how disruptive that could be to a child's body as they're continuing to develop. So that's one reason. The second thing I want to say is, and I'm going to stress in terms of the peace of mind, Dr. Zimmerman pointed it out briefly in terms of what we have put our children through in terms of in school, out of school, on Zoom, part school, here and there. And if we're stressed, think about what a child is that has very little control over their lives, very little control over their activities, very little control over what they can and cannot do. And that is being disrupted. We know the routines are the effective way to help a child's development. And we've been disrupting their routines for the past 2 years. Let's not disrupt it anymore by having that routine in the hospital. And finally, I will say is this: the people that are on this call, the people that are on this webinar tonight care. They have dedicated their lives to the care and health and safety of the people that they have sworn to protect. They took an oath to do no harm. And so they're not here serving up misinformation. They're not here serving up disinformation. They're not here serving up something to disrupt or to harm people. They're here giving their time this evening because they care about our community, and they care about our community and want it to be safe and healthy moving forward. And so I want to thank each and every one of our panelists here tonight for giving up their time, for putting their careers in the line of fire for us to keep us and our families safe. And I thank you for that personally. I thank you for that as a citizen here in this country, as well as a member here at blackdoctor.org. So if you have any more questions, please, you can visit the NIH website and get all that information about that. You can replay this, tag a friend, share this with people that have children. We'll re-air this tomorrow morning so you can get this information out as well. Keep yourself safe. Make sure that you're getting the right information for you and your family. And with that, I will say good night and good evening.
All right. Thank you.